We live in a dark world where it's easy to feel like evil and darkness is winning. It's sometimes hard for us to hold on to hope with all the fears and worries that life thrusts in front of us. What will happen to the economy? When will the next terrorist attack happen? When will we face another natural disaster? Will something bad happen to my family member? Do I have cancer? How will I pay my debts? In many ways, we live in a world that feels oftentimes like the Saturday between Jesus' cross and his resurrection. We might feel like those disciples, depressed and crushed and feeling that all is lost. In the next few weeks, I want to look at the Passion story from John's Gospel. John doesn't go into all the details that some of the other Gospels do, but he brings a unique perspective on the events, and he seems to have been an eyewitness and had a vantage point that some of the other disciples did not. In the first few chapters, we will see that it appears that darkness is winning. Our Lord is arrested, he is tried, he is crucified, his disciples scatter. One disciple betrays him, another one denies him 3 times. The authorities and Satan seem to have the upper hand. But even in the midst of the darkness, we still see signs that God is in control. They're not defeating Jesus, he is willingly laying down his life. At dawn on Sunday, Jesus is vindicated through the resurrection. Today, we're still waiting for the fulfillment of our resurrections, but even in our darkness, we have life and light and the ultimate hope because Jesus has won the ultimate victory. Number 1, Jesus allows himself to be arrested. We're in John chapter 18, starting with verses 1 to 3. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. There's a time to pray, and there's also a time to act. The time to act had come when Jesus had finished his monumental prayers of the last several chapters. And it says that he left with his disciples. As John begins to tell the story of the Passion of Jesus, he continues to focus on the manifestation of the glory of God throughout. At each point in the story so far, the key to understanding all that Jesus does and says has been his identity as the Son of God. Commentator Bruce Milne writes, in the circumstances leading to the apprehension of Jesus, it has already become clear that the whole scenario was anticipated, even planned by him. There's a strange sense of inevitability about his arrest and conviction. Jesus has come from the Father into the world. He goes from the world to the Father. His mission will not have a happy and triumphant conclusion in the eyes of the world. Its wicked rebellion against the claim of God will reach its awful climax in the murder of the Son of God. Only in this way, however, can the darkness be overcome and the Father's love for the world truly disclosed. If the traditional sites are to be relied upon, Jesus and the disciples faced a journey of about a mile, first northwards and then east past the great looming shadow of the temple. And as they passed along the streets, they would have glimpsed through lighted windows groups of pilgrims celebrating the Passover feast, just as they had done minutes before. Jerusalem was teeming with visitors, and it would have been a relief to find themselves at last at the city gate and able to move out into the valley and the fresher air beyond. Their track led them downwards and then across a low valley of the Kidron stream, and then rose gently upwards as they ascended the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives. A short climb would have brought them to their destination, an olive grove, which was part of a garden area of the city. The Kidron ravine that they crossed had a channel that led from Jerusalem's temple altar to the ravine, collecting the blood of the lambs slaughtered and sacrificed during Passover. When Jesus crossed the ravine, it was doubtless red with blood. We know the garden that Jesus was headed for as the Garden of Gethsemane. It was mainly an olive grove. Ray Vanderlaan in his videos located an ancient building with an olive press inside of it that he imagines Jesus using as kind of a shelter that evening at different times. The olive press crushed and would squeeze oil from olives, and it was symbolic of Jesus' suffering. But John calls this a garden rather than an olive grove for a specific reason. Jesus' death and resurrection, which will enable the salvation of all who trust him, are contrasted here with the Garden of Eden, where mankind rebelled against God. It was in a garden that the original betrayal against God took place by Adam and Eve. And it is in a garden that Jesus will go to begin the process of undoing what was done in Eden. But he will again be betrayed by someone that should love him. Jesus goes to this garden with his disciples knowing that this was the place that Judas was sure to find him. There is no attempt to avoid, but rather he is facing what is coming. If you've been betrayed by friends or family, you can be assured that Jesus has experienced that. He knows what it's like. He was betrayed for you, and in order that you might be accepted by God. Jesus is about to die for the life of the world, and the whole world needs it. John doesn't describe Jesus' prayers and agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, but he moves directly to the confrontation of his arrest. Quivering daggers of orange flame begin stabbing the horizon to the west, and soon a procession of torches file into that grove. What irony! With lanterns and torches, the Roman cohort and Jewish officials search to find the light of the world. And the light just stands there without pretense, without protection, and shines openly in the darkness. But those who are standing in the darkness do not recognize him. Judas arrives at the head of a detachment of soldiers and some religious officers and officials. It's an unholy alliance. The religious authorities get their information from a traitor, and they use the power of the Roman military to advance their evil plan. Human power rails against divine power, as if weapons were any match for the power of the Son of God. But here in the garden we see not so much divine omnipotence, meaning God is all-powerful, but we see divine omniscience. God is all-knowing. Jesus stood there, it says, knowing all that was going to happen to him. Nothing happens outside of God's knowledge of everything. You cannot be hidden from his sight nor fall from his care, not even in your Garden of Gethsemane experiences. What is comforting in our suffering is not just that God knows about it, but that he also planned it for some good end that is as yet invisible to us. Why does Judas and the religious authorities bring such a large band of soldiers and torches and swords to arrest Jesus? Do they really think that Jesus would do a miracle of some kind, maybe to resist them? Do they think that Jesus' disciples were up to the challenge of preventing Jesus' arrest? A detachment of soldiers refers to a cohort, a group of 600 soldiers with a military tribune. Now, probably that entire cohort would not have been sent on a night mission like this, but it was still probably a considerable force. The religious leaders must have sold Romans on the danger of Jesus' followers causing a revolt based on his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. John 18, verse 4, then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, whom do you seek? And they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said to them, I am he. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. And so he asked them again, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. And so if you seek me, let these men go. This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. And so Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" We sense John's shock at seeing Judas with them. But John makes it clear that Judas is not the revealer of Jesus, but rather Jesus comes forward and identifies himself. Enemies had not been able to lay their hands on Jesus before in other parts of John. And it is not Judas's presence now that brings success. Rather, it is now the Father's will. Jesus goes to meet this armed band and he asks them, "Who is it that you want?" He knows the answer, but it's for their consideration. Why have they really come? Have they really come to arrest the Son of God? But they play down Jesus' identity and say they're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, a man from the despised north of the country. The authorities have argued already that he can't be the Messiah because he comes from Galilee, John 5:52. Jesus is from the wrong side of the tracks. He is not of the right class. His accent is all wrong. And so they avoid Jesus' true identity by focusing on their presuppositions about him. Commentator Rodney Whitaker writes, "They say they are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, and Jesus responds, 'I am he.'" Here, the humblest of Jesus' names, Jesus of Nazareth, is juxtaposed with his most exalted and divine name. The two together are the crosshairs that target Jesus' identity. He is the human being from an insignificant small town in Galilee who is also God. Jesus' self-identification has been at the heart of this gospel, and this public act of identification produces some very dramatic effects. The "I am he" is a form of "I am," the divine name that God used when he introduced himself to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3. When he uses the divine "I am," it says they draw back and they fall to the ground. People falling to the ground in the presence of God is mentioned elsewhere in Scripture. For example, Ezekiel 1, Daniel 10:9, and Revelation 1:17. But here, the ones who are falling are his enemies rather than his worshipers. Here is a little preview of the moment in the future when every knee will bow to Jesus, Philippians 2:10. And all things will be brought into subjection to him, 1 Corinthians 15:27 and Philippians 3:21. Even those who do not own allegiance to him, and thus for whom their submission will be hell. Jesus puts the question to them again. The impression given by this passage is that they have been completely neutralized and that he must allow the events to proceed and basically give them permission now to take him. Amazingly, they answer the same as before. They're seeking Jesus of Nazareth. They have had this experience with the numinous, God's power and holiness, but it hasn't spoken to them at all. They were just doing their job. And so this repetition of the question, "Whom do you seek?" emphasizes its importance, for it focuses us on Jesus. It's also a question that searches the soul. It's a question that you and I have to answer. Who is it that we seek? What is it that we are seeking? And it harkens back to the beginning of John's gospel, because the first thing that Jesus says in this gospel literally is, "What are you seeking?" back in John 1:38. And his question there was for the two disciples of John the Baptist, and their reply indicated that they wanted to be with him. They were seeking him. Now we see people seeking Jesus, but not for their soul's sake, not because they want to be with him and learn from him. They have their own agenda, as many people do today. There are ways of seeking Jesus that do not bring us life. Jesus repeats the "I am," but now allows the proceedings to continue by telling them to let his followers go. He issues orders to those who are arresting him. The formula used here to speak of the fulfillment of scriptures from the Old Testament is being used of Jesus' own words. The Word himself, who created all that exists, has spoken of his protection for those that the Father has given him. John 6:39 and 10:28 and 17:12. And now he fulfills that word. Here is Jesus, the Good Shepherd, caring for his flock. It's a glimpse of the grace that's at work throughout the Passion, as it has been throughout Jesus' ministry. Jesus' caring heart is our security. Because of it, he will not lose one of those the Father has given. The Good Shepherd has committed himself to his sheep. When the wolf comes, he will remain and defend the flock he loves. Whatever the wolf may represent in our lives today, guilt, shame from past failures, accusing voices of criticism, sudden paralyzing feelings of inadequacy that come snapping and snarling at our heels, the Good Shepherd is there to meet them and to issue his word of command, "Let my disciple go." The action of Jesus in drawing the enmity upon himself so that his disciples can go free is a depiction of the whole work of atonement. He is taking our place. He is absorbing our guilt and all of its implications that we might go free. Bearing shame and scoffing rude, in my place, condemned, he stood. Jesus has demonstrated that he has complete power over these adversaries, and he has expressed his will that the disciples be let go. But Peter still thinks he has to resist with force, kind of prove that he's going to stand with Jesus. The fact that Peter only got the man's right ear suggests some possibilities. Perhaps Peter was left-handed. Maybe he attacked the man from behind. Maybe the man moved, or maybe simply Peter had bad aim, which is my preferred theory. I think Peter was trying to cut off the guy's head and he missed badly and got his ear instead. He was very inept as a soldier. We're told that the servant's name is Malchus. Now, why would John give us that detail? Partly to give us evidence that what is being said here is real history with real people. John is basically saying, if you doubt my story, go look up this man Malchus and ask him what happened. You can trust John's gospel. You can believe that what he's saying is true because he takes such care to not only tell you of the great truths of Christ, but also the little details of the story, like this man's name. Jesus also shows care to this man who is his enemy by healing his ear, we see in Luke 22:51. In any case, Peter's boldness, though it is great, it is as obvious as his misunderstanding. He's not at all in sync with God's will. And this isn't the first time that we find Peter out of step. John 13:6-9, Matthew 16:22-23, Mark 8:32-33. Jesus says to him, "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" This image of a cup was used in the Old Testament to denote suffering, Psalm 75:8. And it was in particular used to represent the wrath of God. Isaiah 51:17-22, Jeremiah 25:15-27, and many others. Jesus was going to fulfill the plan of God to sacrifice himself in order to save us. And so we need to think on Jesus' willingness to humble himself and become obedient, even to death on a cross, so that we might have the same attitude within us. Philippians 2:5-11. Number 2, Jesus on trial and Peter tested. Verse 12, so the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Some people are often confused why both Annas and Caiaphas are called the high priest in this gospel and in other places. Annas held the office of high priest between AD 6 and 15 until he was removed from that position by Rome. The Jews probably never truly accepted Rome's meddling in this, because typically a man was a high priest for life once he got that office. And so Annas was kind of a high priest emeritus. He was head of a priestly dynasty where he still had tremendous influence and control. As many as five of his sons, and now his son-in-law Joseph Caiaphas, have held the position of high priest in the time since he was removed from office. This nepotism and family dynasty was not how high priests were supposed to have been chosen. It shows the deep corruption in the temple system that Jesus was resisting and confronting, including when he turned over the tables and drove out the money changers at the temple. The latest Chosen movie that you can find in theaters depicts this confrontation dramatically. Jesus' own disciples wonder if Jesus has gone crazy when he starts turning over tables and getting out a whip and driving people out. And the Jewish authorities, of course, are incensed and begin to look for opportunities to kill Jesus. Caiaphas' understanding that one man should die for the people becomes a kind of prophetic. His idea is that if Jesus is going to cause them trouble, if he's going to threaten their position of power, if he's going to stir up the Romans, then keeping the status quo is going to mean getting rid of Jesus. But of course, we know that Jesus was the Son of God. He came to die for all the people of the world, and this would not obviously be a fair trial before this ruler who had already decided that Jesus' death would be to their advantage, but it didn't take God by surprise. Verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest, but Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. It was a dark and cold night, both physically and spiritually. The other disciple mentioned here is likely John himself. In his gospel, John doesn't usually name his own name. At one point, he calls himself the disciple who Jesus loved. And here, I think that John calls himself the other disciple. We do not know for sure why it is that John knows at least members of the high priest's household, if not the high priest himself, and why John has access this night. Likely, his father Zebedee's fishing business had a marketing agreement to supply the high priest's household fish. But John is able to follow Jesus inside the court of the high priest while Peter is waiting outside, and then John is able to gain access for Peter as well to some extent. But on the way in, Peter is confronted by a servant girl who asks him, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" Her attitude seems to be that to be one of Jesus' disciples is ridiculous, it's disreputable, it's something a respectable person would want to distance themselves from. By saying also, it's apparent that she knew that John was Jesus' disciple. John doesn't seem to hide that fact, and it must have been known to the high priest's household, but Peter responds with fear in the heat of the moment. He says, "I am not." It's a big contrast, isn't it, from Jesus, who came out before an armed band in the garden and said, "I am he." Peter says, "I am not." He denies knowing and following his rabbi that he's followed for about 3 years. In addition, having entered the courtyard, Peter now finds himself huddled around a charcoal fire trying to keep warm on this cold night. A charcoal fire gives off warmth but very little light. This dim fire, along with the darkness of the garden, helps account for Peter's not being recognized immediately by the relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. Peter was out in the half light, separated from Jesus, while John was inside the court with the light of the world, being eyewitness to what was happening. Peter has become closer in proximity to the people who were opposed to Jesus. In that half-light, surrounded by enemies, separated from Jesus, Peter doesn't have the resources to make his stand for Jesus. The only hope for any of us when we face temptation is to stay close to Jesus. Peter is now with the servants and officials of the high priest. Don't underestimate the effect of one small denial. A journey that is 1 point off on a compass will lead to a very distant destination once it crosses the Atlantic of our lives. John's account will keep contrasting Jesus' standing in front of the high priest with Peter's denial outside in the courtyard in the dark and in the cold. Verse 19, the scene jumps back inside to where the high priest is questioning Jesus, and it says the high priest again questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So back inside, Annas is beginning his interrogation. It's not an actual trial. Here, John has not confused this encounter with the meeting that will take place later with Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. There are no witnesses, no jury, no sentence here. This is really more of a police interrogation of a newly arrested criminal before any formal trial procedures are begun. Annas asked Jesus about his disciples, reflecting the Sanhedrin's earlier concern over Jesus' popularity in John 11:48, a popularity that only increased after Jesus entered Jerusalem attended by a great crowd. Indeed, some of the Pharisees said it looked like the whole world had gone after him in John 12:19. And it's also asked about Jesus' teaching. He seems to want Jesus to incriminate himself as a false prophet or at least a false teacher, but Jesus will not be trapped in this way. The high priest, of course, is not really looking for information. He's simply trying to spring a trap, but Jesus won't be caught. Furthermore, Jesus has already completed his public teaching regarding himself. He only has one last statement of teaching that remains, and that is reserved for the Gentile Pilate. Jesus does nothing to assure Annas that his teaching is kosher, and that would increase Annas' fears. Indeed, Jesus shows a lot of courage at this point, which is so unlike the way that most people come, cringing before the Sanhedrin, showing Annas that Jesus is indeed a danger. Jesus' appeal to the witnesses of those who had heard him is essentially a demand for a fair trial, since in Jewish law, the witnesses were questioned, not the accused. Everything about this trial would be unlawful and unjust. It is now up to those who have heard Jesus to bear witness to him. Such remains the case today. His abiding presence remains with believers, but those who abide in him are to bear witness to him before the world. For some reason, the guard feels that this is disrespectful talk and strikes Jesus, probably slaps him. This blow is probably more of an insult than physically damaging. The guard somehow thinks that the high priest is being offended by Jesus' answer, and that this offense is greater than his own offense of slapping the Son of God. Jesus' response is brilliant. If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I've said is right, why do you strike me? Their verbal blows were failing to land, and so they hit Jesus. The last resort of those who have been intellectually defeated is physical violence. The real question is not, is this any way to talk to the high priest, but is this any way for the high priest to behave? This reminds me of some videos I have seen online where maybe people are arguing about matters of social justice or politics, and often there's one person who is reasonably calm and trying to rationally use arguments to make their case, but the other person, or maybe a mob of people, is yelling and screaming and swearing and saying, you're a horrible person, you have no morals, because that they don't agree with their angry, radical perspectives. In many countries, it is unusual for people to oppose Christians with physical violence. Instead, they do so with verbal violence. They sneer, they joke, they mock, they ridicule, and where possible, they use the law to repress. But there are many other countries in the world today where physical violence is a real risk. Recently, 80 Christians were beheaded in Congo by radical Muslims. An untold number of Christians have been slaughtered in Syria recently by radical Muslims. I saw one heartbreaking scene of a Christian who had been nailed to a cross and then was shot in the head with a machine gun. When a regime resorts to physical violence, it actually reveals their weakness. If they had nothing to fear from the gospel of Jesus, they would just ignore Christians and not oppose them. Those who oppose us do so because they fear the power of our lives and message. If you face injustice because of the name of Jesus, take courage. You are in good company, and your Savior went through this ahead of you. The scene now switches back to the courtyard where Peter caves in to fear 2 more times. Verse 25, now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, and so they said to him, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. Jesus has stood up to a powerful leader, but John's narrative goes back to Peter at the fire, and we find that he continues to deny that he is a follower of Jesus. He's asked the same question a second time, and Peter again says, I am not. I'm not one of his followers. The screws get tightened more when a relative of Malchus, the man whose ear Peter cut off, recognizes him. Peter vehemently denies this and curses, the other Gospels say. Right then the rooster crows, and Jesus' prediction about Peter denying him 3 times before it crows is proven prophetic, much to Peter's shame and previous self-confidence. We can't be too hard on Peter because we see the pressure that he's under and the fear of this night that is consuming him. This is a very dark night. Annas, who represents the religious establishment, rejects Jesus. Then Peter, the designated leader of Jesus' new kingdom community, denies Jesus 3 times. Peter, who had heard Jesus' teaching, witnessed his miracles, 5,000 fed, fish filling his boat, walking on the water, the lame walk, the blind see, lepers cleansed, demons cast out, even the dead raised. Peter, who had seen Jesus' glory on the Mount of Transfiguration, despite all of Jesus' warnings and predictions, Peter and Peter's self-assurance that he wouldn't do this, he denied the Lord. 3 times he says, I'm not with Jesus. I don't know him. In the moment when Jesus needed him the most, he turned his back on him and walked out of fear, away out of fear for his life. The darkness of that night lingers today. Bruce Milne says, how many Christians live with a continual sense of failure because of their inability or unwillingness to stand clearly for Christ in their public lives. Like Peter, we find ourselves drawn step by step into ever deeper compromise until existence is a continuous denial. And worship with God's people on Sunday, instead of renewing and invigorating us, serves only to underline the hypocrisy of our lives. How often I can be like Peter, reluctant, sometimes embarrassed to put Jesus forward to people that I know don't like or appreciate him. Oh God, will you increase our courage? Give us the courage to be a witness for Jesus in a dark world that is so often opposed and hateful toward Jesus. There's a third darkness, however, that's more terrible in a way than the others. It's the apparent weakness of God, the darkness of God's seeming failure here. Here is God's very Son, creating the creating and upholding word of life, who is apparently a helpless pawn in the hands of his enemies, tossed from one to the other like a shuttlecock by men who appear able to bend the process of justice at will and to plot the most unjust sentence in the history of law. The one who in the garden sent his assailants reeling back with a majestic "I am," now succumbs like any other prisoner to his interrogators and torturers in a scene replicated daily in any 100 of countries around the world today. In Jesus' pilgrimage to Calvary, we encounter not just triumph, but also what Paul perceptively called the weakness of God, 1 Corinthians 1:25. We can all identify with that weakness. The God who apparently was not there when we needed him, the prayers that we feel have gone unanswered, the disappointments that have shattered our dreams, the tragedies that have befallen us, the problems that prayer and pleading and praise seem unable to relieve or alleviate. God's weakness also appears in the wider world, in the atrocities that are daily permitted around the globe, and in the spectacle of the needy millions who are starving or refugees or abused or diseased. God, if he really owns this globe, as it is, it seems, at best weak and limited, and clearly not up to the demands of ruling the world. But of course, you and I know, appearances are very deceptive, just as they were in these days of Jesus' passion. Jesus allows all of his suffering in order to fulfill God's plan for our sake. It was never out of his control. And even today, he has a plan and a purpose for allowing certain things in our lives. In conclusion, there are positive elements in this passage, shining like stars in the darkness. The first is God's presence. In verse 14, John reminds the readers that Caiaphas advised the Jews that it would be good if one man died for the people. But God was behind this, using it for his purpose. Peter would tell them weeks later, "You, with the help of wicked men, put Jesus to death," Acts 2:23. But this man was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge. Jesus stands before the flawed high priest of his nation and vindicates in a wonderful way his title as the true high priest of the people of God. Jesus is the one who is able to sympathize with our weaknesses because he himself was subjected to weakness. He was tempted in every way, just as we are, but was without sin. And so, Jesus is able to help us in our time of need, Hebrews tells us. The second thing is God's plans. If we look again at Peter, we can discern another star. On the surface, his threefold denial appears to be a disaster. But even his failure was not outside of God's plans for Peter. Peter was not abandoned. God will restore and use him. Peter's main characteristic in his life was his self-confidence. And God needed to humble him before he could empower and use him. Peter no longer trusts what he knows or his own strength, but he falls back on what Jesus knows and can do. And in that moment of defeat, Peter, an inadequate man of sand, becomes Peter the rock, who is strong and dependable, precisely because he has learned to utterly depend on Christ. And then third, God's prisoner. The supreme star shining in this dark night is Jesus himself. He stands within the darkness and takes its terror into his own heart. But he remains standing. It does not engulf him. He is the faithful witness, Revelation 1:5, who embodies the truth of God in the midst of shadows of falsehood that encircle him. The light shines in the darkness, John says in John 1:5, but the darkness has not overcome it. Solzhenitsyn once said, one person speaking the truth has more power than a whole city living in falsehood. The darkness may encompass us, dreams may remain unfulfilled, sorrow or tragedy may strike, prayers may seem to be unanswered, weakness lingers, but in the light of God's truth, His truth still shines in the darkness. And until the day breaks and the shadows forever will flee away, we can trust Him.